Sorry, small hiccup there. I'm back. I think it's working again. So let's start again. Happy Friday. I'm happy to see you all. It's a beautiful day in Providence. And let's read some Harry Potter. Okay, we're on chapter 10, Mayhem at the Ministry. And my dog is walking around and whining. Sorry. Mr. Weasley woke them after only a few hours' sleep. He used magic to pack up the tents, and they left the campsite as quickly as possible, passing Mr. Roberts at the door of his cottage. Mr. Roberts had a strange, dazed look about him, and he waved them off with a vague, "Merry Christmas." Sorry, hold on. Here we go. "He'll be all right," said Mr. Weasley quietly as they marched off onto the moor. Sometimes when a person's memory's modified, it makes him a bit disorientated for a while. And that was a big thing they had to make him forget. "Go to bed, Winnie." They heard urgent voices as they approached the spot where the portkeys lay, and when they reached it, they found a great number of witches and wizards gathered around Basil, the keeper of the portkeys, all clamoring to get away from the campsite as quickly as possible. Mr. Weasley had a hurried discussion with Basil. They joined the queue and were able to take an old rubber tire back to Stoat's Head Hill before the sun had really risen. They walked back through Ottery St. Catchpole and up the damp lane toward the burrow in the dawn light, talking very little because they were so exhausted, and thinking longingly of their breakfast. As they rounded the corner and the burrow came into view, a cry echoed along the lane. "Oh, thank goodness! Thank goodness!" Mrs. Weasley, who had evidently been waiting for them in the front yard, came running toward them, still wearing her bedroom slippers, her face pale and strained, a rolled-up copy of the Daily Prophet clutched in her hand. "Arthur, I've been so worried, so worried!" She flung her arms around Mr. Weasley's neck, and the Daily Prophet fell out of her limp hand onto the ground. Looking down, Harry saw the headline, "Scenes of Terror at the Quidditch World Cup," complete with a twinkling black and white photograph of the dark mark over the treetops. "You're all right," Mrs. Weasley muttered distractedly, releasing Mr. Weasley and staring around at them all with red eyes. "You're alive. Oh, boys!" And to everybody's surprise, she seized Fred and George and pulled them both into such a tight hug that their heads banged together. "Ouch! Mom, you're strangling us!" "I shouted at you before you left," Mrs. Weasley said, starting to sob. "It's all I've been thinking about. What if you know who had got you, and the last thing I ever said to you was that you didn't get enough OWLs? Oh, Fred, George!" "Come on now, Molly, we're all perfectly okay," said Mr. Weasley soothingly, prizing her off the twins and leading her back toward the house. "Bill," he added in an undertone, "pick up that paper. I want to see what it says." When they were all crammed into the tiny kitchen and Hermione had made Mrs. Weasley a cup of very strong tea, into which Mr. Weasley insisted on pouring a shot of Ogden's old fire whiskey, Bill handed his father the newspaper. Mr. Weasley scanned the front page while Percy looked over his shoulder. "I knew it," said Mr. Weasley heavily. "Ministry blunders, culprits not apprehended, lax security, dark wizards running unchecked, national disgrace. Who wrote this? Ah, of course, Rita Skeeter." "That woman's got it in for the Ministry of Magic," said Percy furiously. "Last week she was saying we're wasting our time quibbling about cauldron thickness when we should be stamping out vampires, as if it wasn't specifically stated in paragraph 12 of the guidelines for the treatments of non-wizard part humans." "Do us a favor, Perce," said Bill, yawning, "and shut up." "I mentioned," said Mr. Weasley, his eyes widening behind his glasses as he reached the bottom of the Daily Prophet article. "Where?" spluttered Mrs. Weasley, choking on her tea and whiskey. "If I'd seen that, I'd have known you were alive." "Not by name," said Mr. Weasley. "Listen to this. If the terrified witches and wizards who waited breathlessly for news at the edge of the wood expected reassurance from the Ministry of Magic, they were sadly disappointed. A ministry official emerged some time after the appearance of the dark mark, alleging that nobody had been hurt, but refusing to give any more information. Whether this statement will be enough to quash the rumors that several bodies were removed from the woods an hour later remains to be seen." "Oh, really?" said Mr. Weasley in exasperation, handing the paper to Percy. "Nobody was hurt. What was I supposed to say? Rumors that several bodies were removed from the woods. Well, there certainly will be rumors now she's printed that." He heaved a deep sigh. "Molly, I'm going to have to go into the office. This is going to take some smoothing over." "I'll come with you, Father," said Percy importantly. "Mr. Crouch will need all hands on deck, and I can give him my cauldron report in person." He bustled out of the kitchen. Mrs. Weasley looked most upset. Arthur, you're supposed to be on holiday. This hasn't got anything to do with your office. Surely they can handle this without you. I've got to go, Molly, said Mr. Weasley. I've made things worse. I'll just change into my robes and I'll be off. Mrs. Weasley, said Harry suddenly, unable to contain himself. Hedwig hasn't arrived with a letter for me, has she? Hedwig, dear? Said Mrs. Weasley distractedly. No, there hasn't been any post at all. Ron and Hermione looked curiously at Harry. With a meaningful look at both of them, he said, All right if I go and dump my stuff in your room, Ron? Yeah, I think I will too, said Ron at once. Hermione? Yes, she said quickly, and the three of them marched out of the kitchen and up the stairs. What's up, Harry? Said Ron, the moment they had closed the door of the attic room behind them. There's something I haven't told you, Harry said. On Saturday morning, I woke up with my scar hurting again. Ron and Hermione's reactions were almost exactly as Harry had imagined them back in his bedroom on Privet Drive. Hermione gasped and started making suggestions at once, mentioning a number of reference books and everybody from Albus Dumbledore to Madame Pomfrey, the Hogwarts nurse. Ron simply looked dumbstruck. But he wasn't there, was he? You know who? I mean, last time your scar kept hurting, he was at Hogwarts, wasn't he? I'm sure he wasn't on Privet Drive, said Harry. But I was dreaming about him. Him and Peter, you know, Wormtail. I can't remember all of it now, but they were plotting to kill someone. He had teetered for a moment on the verge of saying me, but couldn't bring himself to make Hermione look any more horrified than she already did. It was only a dream, said Ron bracingly. Just a nightmare. Yeah, but was it though? Said Harry, turning to look out of the window at the brightening sky. It's weird, isn't it? My scar hurts, and 3 days later the Death Eaters are on the march, and Voldemort's sign's up in the sky again. Don't say his name, Ron hissed through gritted teeth. And remember what Professor Trelawney said? Harry went on, ignoring Ron. At the end of last year, Professor Trelawney was their divination teacher at Hogwarts. Hermione's terrified look vanished as she let out a derisive snort. Oh, Harry, you aren't going to pay attention to anything that old fraud says. You weren't there, said Harry. You didn't hear her. This time she was different. I told you she went into a trance, a real one. And she said the Dark Lord would rise again, greater and more terrible than ever before, and he'd manage it because his servant was going to go back to him. And that night, Wormtail escaped. There was a silence in which Ron fidgeted absent-mindedly with a hole in his Chudley Cannon's bedspread. Why were you asking if Hedwig had come, Harry? Hermione asked. Are you expecting a letter? I told Sirius about my scar, said Harry, shrugging. I'm waiting for his answer. Good thinking, said Ron, his expression clearing. I bet Sirius will know what to do. I hoped he'd get back to me quickly, said Harry. But we don't know where Sirius is. He could be in Africa or somewhere, couldn't he? Said Hermione reasonably. Hedwig's not going to manage that journey in a few days. Yeah, I know, said Harry, but there was a leaden feeling in his stomach as he looked out of the window at the Hedwig-free sky. Come and have a game of Quidditch in the orchard, Harry, said Ron. Come on, 3-on-3. Bill and Charlie and Fred and George will play. You can try out the Wronski feint. Ron, said Hermione in an I don't think you're being very sensitive sort of voice, Harry doesn't want to play Quidditch right now. He's worried, and he's tired. We all need to go to bed. Yeah, I want to play Quidditch, said Harry suddenly. Hang on, I'll get my firebolt. Hermione left the room, muttering something that sounded very much like boys. Neither Mr. Weasley nor Percy was at home much over the following week. Both left the house each morning before the rest of the family got up, and returned well after dinner every night. It's been an absolute uproar, Percy told them importantly the Sunday evening before they were due to return to Hogwarts. I've been putting out fires all week. People keep sending howlers, and of course if you don't open a howler straight away, it explodes. Scorch marks all over my desk, and my best quill reduced to cinders. Why are they all sending howlers? Asked Ginny, who was mending her copy of 1000 Magical Herbs and Fungi with spellotape on the rug in front of the living room fire. Complaining about security at the World Cup, said Percy. They want compensation for their ruined property. Mundungus Fletcher's put in a claim for a 12-bedroom tent with ensuite jacuzzi, but I've got his number. I know for a fact he was sleeping under a cloak propped on sticks. Mrs. Weasley glanced at the grandfather clock in the corner. Harry liked this clock. It was completely useless if you wanted to know the time, but otherwise very informative. It had 9 golden hands, and each of them was engraved with one of the Weasley family's names. There were no numerals around the face, but descriptions of where each family member might be. Home, school, and work were there, but there was also traveling, lost, hospital, prison, and in the position where the number 12 would be on a normal clock, mortal peril. 8 of the hands were currently pointing to the home position, but Mr. Weasley's, which was the longest, was still pointing to work. Mrs. Weasley sighed. Your father hasn't had to go into the office on weekends since the days of you-know-who, she said. They're working him far too hard. His dinner's going to be ruined if he doesn't come home soon. Well, father feels he's got to make up for his mistake at the match, doesn't he? Said Percy. If truth be told, he was a tad unwise to make a public statement without clearing it with his head of department first. Don't you dare blame your father for what that wretched Skeeter woman wrote, said Mrs. Weasley, flaring up at once. If Dad hadn't said anything, old Rita would just have said it was disgraceful that nobody from the ministry had commented, said Bill, who was playing chess with Ron. Rita Skeeter never makes anyone look good. Remember, she interviewed all the Gringotts charm breakers once and called me a long-haired pillock? Well, it is a bit long, dear, said Mrs. Weasley gently. If you just let me... No, Mum. Rain lashed against the living room window. Hermione was immersed in the Standard Book of Spells, Grade 4, copies of which Mrs. Weasley had bought for her, Harry, and Ron at Diagon Alley. Charlie was darning a fireproof balaclava. Harry was polishing his firebolt, the broomstick servicing kit Hermione had given him for his 13th birthday open at his feet. Fred and George were sitting in a far corner, quills out, talking in whispers, their heads bent over a piece of parchment. What are you two up to? Said Mrs. Weasley sharply, her eyes on the twins. Homework, said Fred vaguely. Don't be ridiculous, you're still on holiday, said Mrs. Weasley. Yeah, we've left it a bit late, said George. You're not by any chance writing out a new order form, are you? Said Mrs. Weasley shrewdly. You wouldn't be thinking of restarting Weasley's Wizard Wheezes by any chance? Now, Mum, said Fred, looking up at her, a pained look on his face. If the Hogwarts Express crashed tomorrow and George and I died, how would you feel to know that the last thing we ever heard from you was an unfounded accusation? Everyone laughed, even Mrs. Weasley. Oh, your father's coming, she said suddenly, looking up at the clock again. Mr. Weasley's hand had suddenly spun from work to traveling. A second later, it had shuddered to a halt on home with the others, and they heard him calling from the kitchen. Coming, Arthur, called Mrs. Weasley, hurrying out of the room. A few minutes later, Mr. Weasley came into the warm living room, carrying his dinner on a tray. He looked completely exhausted. Well, the fat's really in the fire now, he told Mrs. Weasley as he sat down in an armchair near the hearth and toyed unenthusiastically with his somewhat shriveled cauliflower. Rita Skeeter's been ferreting around all week, looking up for more ministry mess-ups to report, and now she's found out about poor old Bertha going missing, so that'll be the headline in the Prophet tomorrow. I told Bagman he should have sent someone to look for her ages ago. Mr. Crouch has been saying it for weeks and weeks, said Percy swiftly. Crouch is very lucky Rita hasn't found out about Winky, said Mr. Weasley irritably. There'd be a week's worth of headlines in it if his house elf being caught holding the wand that conjured the dark mark. I thought we all agreed that that elf, while irresponsible, did not conjure the mark, said Percy hotly. If you ask me, Mr. Crouch is very lucky no one at the Daily Prophet knows how mean he is to elves, said Hermione angrily. Now look here, Hermione, said Percy. A high-ranking ministry official like Mr. Crouch deserves unswerving obedience from his servants. His slave, you mean, said Hermione, her voice rising passionately. Because he didn't pay Winky, did he? I think you'd all better go upstairs and check that you've packed properly, said Mrs. Weasley, breaking up the argument. Come on now, all of you. Harry repacked his broomstick servicing kit, put his firebolt over his shoulder, and went back upstairs with Ron. The rain sounded even louder at the top of the house, accompanied by loud whistlings and moans from the wind, not to mention sporadic howls from the ghoul who lived in the attic. Pigwidgeon began twittering and zooming around his cage when they entered. The sight of the half-packed trunk seemed to have sent him to a frenzy of excitement. Bung him some owl treats, said Ron, throwing a packet across to Harry. It might shut him up. Harry poked a few owl treats through the bars of Pigwidgeon's cage, then turned to his trunk. Hedwig's cage stood next to it, still empty. It's been over a week, Harry said, looking at Hedwig's deserted perch. Ron, you don't reckon Sirius has been caught, do you? Nah, it would have been in the Daily Prophet, said Ron. The ministry would want to show they'd caught someone, wouldn't they? Yeah, I suppose. Look, here's the stuff Mum got for you in Diagon Alley. And she's got some gold out of your vault, too. And she's washed all your socks. He heaved a pile of parcels onto Harry's camp bed and dropped the money bag and a load of socks next to it. Harry started unwrapping the shopping. Apart from the Standard Book of Spells, Grade 4 by Miranda Goshawk, he had a handful of new quills, a dozen rolls of parchment, and refills for his potion-making kit. He'd been running low on spine of lionfish and essence of belladonna. He was just piling underwear into his cauldron when Ron made a loud noise of disgust behind him. "What is that supposed to be?" He was holding up something that looked to Harry like a long maroon velvet dress. It had a moldy-looking lace frill at the collar and matching lace cuffs. There was a knock on the door, and Mrs. Weasley entered, carrying an armful of freshly laundered Hogwarts robes. "Here you are," she said, sorting them into 2 piles. "Now mind you pack them properly so they don't crease." "Mum, you've given me Ginny's new dress," said Ron, handing it out to her. "Of course I haven't," said Mrs. Weasley. "That's for you. Dress robes." "What?" said Ron, looking horror-struck. "Dress robes," repeated Mrs. Weasley. "It says on your school list that you're supposed to have dress robes this year. Robes for formal occasions." "You've got to be kidding," said Ron in disbelief. "I'm not wearing that. No way." "Everyone wears them, Ron," said Mrs. Weasley crossly. "They're all like that. Your father's got some for smart parties." "I'll go stargers before I put that on," said Ron stubbornly. "Don't be so silly," said Mrs. Weasley. "You've got to have dress robes. They're on your list. I got some for Harry, too. Show him, Harry." In some trepidation, Harry opened the last parcel on his camp bed. It wasn't as bad as he had expected, however. His dress robes didn't have any lace on them at all. In fact, they were more or less the same as his school ones, except they were bottle green instead of black. "I thought they'd bring out the color of your eyes, dear," said Mrs. Weasley fondly. "Well, they're okay," said Ron angrily, looking at Harry's robes. "Why couldn't I have some like that?" "Because, well, I had to get your second hand, and there wasn't a lot of choice," said Mrs. Weasley, flushing. Harry looked away. He would willingly have split all the money in his Gringotts vault with the Weasleys, but he knew they would never take it. "I'm never wearing them," Ron was saying stubbornly. "Never." "Fine," snapped Mrs. Weasley. "Go naked. And Harry, make sure you get a picture of him. Goodness knows I could do with a laugh." She left the room, slamming the door behind her. There was a funny spluttering noise from behind them. Pigwidgeon was choking on an overlarge owl treat. "Why is everything I own rubbish?" said Ron furiously, striding across the room to unstick Pigwidgeon's beak. Chapter 11. Aboard the Hogwarts Express. There was a definite end of the holidays gloom in the air when Harry awoke the next morning. Heavy rain was still splattering against the window as he got dressed in jeans and a sweatshirt. They would change into their school robes on the Hogwarts Express. He, Ron, Fred, and George had just reached the first floor landing on their way down to breakfast when Mrs. Weasley appeared at the foot of the stairs, looking harassed. "Arthur!" she called up the staircase. "Arthur! Urgent message from the Ministry!" Harry flattened himself against the wall as Mr. Weasley came clattering past with his robes on back to front, and hurtled out of sight. When Harry and the others entered the kitchen, they saw Mrs. Weasley rummaging anxiously in the drawers. "I've got a quill here somewhere," and Mr. Weasley bending over the fire, talking to... Harry shut his eyes hard and opened them again to make sure that they were working properly. Amos Diggory's head was sitting in the middle of the flames like a large, bearded egg. It was talking very fast, completely unperturbed by the sparks flying around it and the flames licking its ears. "Muggle neighbors heard bangs and shouting, so they went and called those, policemen. Arthur, you've got to get over there." "Here," said Mrs. Weasley breathlessly, pushing a piece of parchment, a bottle of ink, and a crumpled quill into Mr. Weasley's hands. "It's a real stroke of luck I heard about it," said Mr. Diggory's head. "I had to come into the office early to send a couple of owls, and I found the improper use of magic lot all setting off. If Rita Skeeter gets a hold of this one, Arthur." "What does Mad Eye say happened?" asked Mr. Weasley, unscrewing the ink bottle, loading up his quill, and preparing to take notes. Mr. Diggory's head rolled its eyes. "Says he heard an intruder in his yard. Says he was creeping toward the house, but was ambushed by his dustbins." "What did the dustbins do?" asked Mr. Weasley, scribbling frantically. "Made one hell of a noise and fired rubbish everywhere, as far as I can tell," said Mr. Diggory. "Apparently one of them was still rocketing around when the policeman turned up." Mr. Weasley groaned. "And what about the intruder?" "Arthur, you know Mad Eye," said Mr. Diggory's head, rolling his eyes again. "Someone creeping into his yard in the dead of night? More likely there's a very shell-shocked cat wandering around here somewhere, covered in potato peelings. But if the improper use of magic lot get their hands on Mad Eye, he's had it. Think of his record. We've got to get him off on a minor charge, something in your department. What are exploding dustbins worth?" "Might be a caution," said Mr. Weasley, still writing very fast, his brow furrowed. "Mad Eye didn't use his wand? He didn't actually attack anyone?" I'll bet he leapt out of bed and started jinxing everything he could reach through the window, said Mr. Diggory. But they'll have a job proving it. There aren't any casualties. All right, I'm off, Mr. Weasley said, and he stuffed the parchment with his notes on it into his pocket and dashed out of the kitchen again. Mr. Diggory's head looked around at Mrs. Weasley. Sorry about this, Molly, it said, more calmly. Bothering you so early and everything. But Arthur's the only one who can get Mad-Eye off, and Mad-Eye's supposed to be starting his new job today. Why he had to choose last night. Never mind, Amos, said Mrs. Weasley. Sure you won't have a bit of toast or anything before you go? Well, go on then, said Mr. Diggory. Mrs. Weasley took a piece of buttered toast from a stack on the kitchen table, put it into the fire tongs, and transferred it into Mr. Diggory's mouth. Thanks, he said in a muffled voice, and then with a small pop, vanished. Harry could hear Mr. Weasley calling hurried goodbyes to Bill, Charlie, Percy, and the girls. Within 5 minutes, he was back in the kitchen, his robes on the right way now, dragging a comb through his hair. I'd better hurry. You have a good term, boys, said Mr. Weasley to Harry and Ron and the twins, fastening a cloak over his shoulders and preparing to disapparate. Molly, are you going to be all right taking the kids to King's Cross? Of course I will, she said. You just look after Mad-Eye. We'll be fine. As Mr. Weasley vanished, Bill and Charlie entered the kitchen. Did someone say Mad-Eye? Bill asked. What's he been up to now? He says someone tried to break into his house last night, said Mrs. Weasley. Mad-Eye Moody? Said George thoughtfully, spreading marmalade on his toast. Isn't he that nutter? Your father thinks very highly of Mad-Eye Moody, said Mrs. Weasley sternly. Yeah, well, Dad collects plugs, doesn't he? Said Fred quietly as Mrs. Weasley left the room. Birds of a feather. Moody was a great wizard in his time, said Bill. He's an old friend of Dumbledore's, isn't he? Said Charlie. Dumbledore's not what you'd call normal, though, is he? Said Fred. I mean, I know he's a genius and everything. Who is Mad-Eye? Asked Harry. He's retired. He used to work at the ministry, said Charlie. I met him once when Dad took me in to work with him. He was an Auror, one of the best. A dark wizard catcher, he added, seeing Harry's blank look. Half the cells in Azkaban are full because of him. He made loads of enemies, though. The families of people he caught, mainly. And I heard he's been getting really paranoid in his old age. Doesn't trust anyone anymore. Sees dark wizards everywhere. Bill and Charlie decided to come and see everyone off at King's Cross Station, but Percy, apologizing most profusely, said he really needed to get to work. I just can't justify taking more time off at the moment, he told them. Mr. Crouch is really starting to rely on me. Yeah, you know what, Percy? Said George seriously. I reckon he'll know your name soon. Mrs. Weasley had braved the telephone in the village post office to order 3 ordinary Muggle taxis to take them into London. Arthur tried to borrow ministry cars for us, Mrs. Weasley whispered to Harry as they stood in the rain-washed yard, watching the taxi drivers heaving 6 heavy Hogwarts trunks into their cars. But there weren't any to spare. Oh dear, they don't look happy, do they? Harry didn't like to tell Mrs. Weasley that Muggle taxi drivers rarely transported overexcited owls, and Pigwidgeon was making an ear-splitting racket. Nor did it help that a number of Filibuster's fabulous no-heat wet start fireworks went off unexpectedly when Fred's trunk sprang open, causing the driver carrying it to yell with fright and pain as Crookshanks clawed his way up the man's leg. The journey was uncomfortable, owing to the fact that they were jammed in the back of the taxis with their trunks. Crookshanks took quite a while to recover from the fireworks, and by the time they entered London, Harry, Ron, and Hermione were all severely scratched. They were very relieved to get out at King's Cross, even though the rain was coming down harder than ever, and they got soaked carrying their trunks across the busy road and into the station. Harry was used to getting onto platform 9 3/4 by now. It was a simple matter of walking straight through the apparently solid barrier dividing platforms 9 and 10. The only tricky part was doing this in an unobtrusive way so as to avoid attracting Muggle attention. They did it in groups today. Harry, Ron, and Hermione, the most conspicuous since they were accompanied by Pigwidgeon and Crookshanks, went first. They leaned casually against the barrier, chatting unconcernedly, and slid sideways through it, and as they did so, platform 9 3/4 materialized in front of them. The Hogwarts Express, a gleaming scarlet steam engine, was already there, clouds of steam billowing from it, through which the many Hogwarts students and parents on the platform appeared like dark ghosts. Pigwidgeon became noisier than ever in response to the hooting of many owls through the mist. Harry, Ron, and Hermione set off to find seats, and were soon stowing their luggage in a compartment halfway along the train. Then they hopped back down onto the platform to say goodbye to Mrs. Weasley, Bill, and Charlie. I might be seeing you all sooner than you think, said Charlie, grinning as he hugged Ginny goodbye. Why? said Fred keenly. You'll see, said Charlie. Just don't tell Percy I mentioned it. It's classified information until such time as the ministry sees fit to release it, after all. Yeah, I sort of wish I were back at Hogwarts this year, said Bill, hands in his pockets, looking almost wistfully at the train. Why? Said George impatiently. You're going to have an interesting year, said Bill, his eyes twinkling. I might even get time off to come and watch a bit of it. A bit of what? Said Ron. But at that moment, the whistle blew and Mrs. Weasley chivied them toward the train doors. Thanks for having us stay, Mrs. Weasley, said Hermione as they climbed on board, closed the doors, and leaned out of the window to talk to her. Yeah, thanks for everything, Mrs. Weasley, said Harry. Oh, it was a pleasure, my dears, said Mrs. Weasley. I'd invite you for Christmas, but, well, I expect you're all going to want to stay at Hogwarts, what with one thing or another. Mum, said Ron irritably, what do you three know that we don't? You'll find out this evening, I expect, said Mrs. Weasley, smiling. It's going to be very exciting, mind you. I'm very glad they've changed the rules. What rules? Said Harry, Ron, Fred, and George together. I'm sure Professor Dumbledore will tell you. Now behave, won't you? Won't you, Fred? And you, George? The pistons hissed loudly, and the train began to move. Tell us what's happening at Hogwarts, Fred bellowed out of the window as Mrs. Weasley, Bill, and Charlie sped away from them. What rules are they changing? But Mrs. Weasley only smiled and waved. Before the train had rounded the corner, she, Bill, Charlie had disapparated. Harry, Ron, and Hermione went back to their compartment. The thick rain splattering the windows made it very difficult to see out of them. Ron undid his trunk, pulled out his maroon dress robes, and flung them over Pigwidgeon's cage to muffle his hooting. Bagman wanted to tell us what's happening at Hogwarts, he said grumpily, sitting down next to Harry. At the World Cup, remember? But my own mother won't say. Wonder what... Shh! Hermione whispered suddenly, pressing her finger to her lips and pointing toward the compartment next to theirs. Harry and Ron listened and heard a familiar, drawling voice drifting in through the open door. Father actually considered sending me to Durmstrang rather than Hogwarts, you know. He knows the headmaster, you see. Well, you know his opinion of Dumbledore. The man's such a mudblood lover, and Durmstrang doesn't admit that sort of riffraff. But Mother didn't like the idea of me going to school so far away. Father says Durmstrang takes a far more sensible line than Hogwarts about the dark arts. Durmstrang students actually learn them, not just the defense rubbish we do. Hermione got up, tiptoed to the compartment door, and slid it shut, blocking out Malfoy's voice. So he thinks Durmstrang would have suited him, does he? She said angrily. I wish he had gone, then we wouldn't have to put up with him. Durmstrang's another wizarding school? Said Harry. Yes, said Hermione sniffily, and it's got a horrible reputation. According to an appraisal of magical education in Europe, it puts a lot of emphasis on the dark arts. I think I've heard of it, said Ron vaguely. Where is it? What country? Well, nobody knows, do they? Said Hermione, raising her eyebrows. Why not? Said Harry. There's traditionally been a lot of rivalry between all the magic schools. Durmstrang and Beauxbaton like to conceal their whereabouts so nobody can steal their secrets, said Hermione matter-of-factly. Come off it, said Ron, starting to laugh. Durmstrang's got to be about the same size as Hogwarts. How are you going to hide a great big castle? But Hogwarts is hidden, said Hermione in surprise. Everyone knows that. Well, everyone who's read Hogwarts a history, anyway. Just you, then, said Ron. So go on. How do you hide a place like Hogwarts? It's bewitched, said Hermione. If a muggle looks at it, all they see is a moldering old ruin with a sign over the entrance saying, Danger, do not enter, unsafe. So Durmstrang will just look like a ruin to an outsider too? Maybe, said Hermione, shrugging. Or it might have muggle repelling charms on it, like the World Cup Stadium. Or to keep foreign wizards from finding it, they'll have made it unplottable. Come again? Well, you can enchant a building so it's impossible to plot on a map, can't you? If you say so, said Harry. But I think Durmstrang must be somewhere in the far north, said Hermione thoughtfully. Somewhere very cold, because they've got fur capes as part of their uniforms. Think of the possibilities, said Ron dreamily. It would have been so easy to push Malfoy off a glacier and make it look like an accident. Shame his mother likes him. The rain became heavier and heavier as the train moved farther north. The sky was so dark and the windows so steamy that the lanterns were lit by midday. The lunch trolley came rattling along the corridor, and Harry bought a large stack of cauldron cakes for them to share. Several of their friends looked in on them as the afternoon progressed, including Seamus Finnegan, Dean Thomas, and Neville Longbottom, a round-faced, extremely forgetful boy who had been brought up by his formidable witch of a grandmother. Seamus was still wearing his Ireland rosette. Some of its magic seemed to be wearing off now. It was still squeaking, "Troy, Mullet, Moran," but in a very feeble and exhausted sort of way. After half an hour or so, Hermione, growing tired of the endless Quidditch talk, buried herself once more in the Standard Book of Spells Grade 4 and started trying to learn a summoning charm. Neville listened jealously to the others' conversations as they relived the cup match. "Gran didn't want me to go," he said miserably. "Wouldn't buy tickets. Sounded amazing, though." "It was," said Ron. "Look at this, Neville." He rummaged in his trunk up in the luggage rack and pulled out the miniature figure of Victor Crumb. "Oh, wow," said Neville enviously, as Ron tipped Crumb onto his pudgy hand. "We saw him right up close as well," said Ron. "We were in the top box." "For the first and last time in your life, Weasley." Draco Malfoy had appeared in the doorway. Behind him stood Crabbe and Goyle, his enormous, thuggish cronies, both of whom appeared to have grown at least a foot during the summer. Evidently, they'd overheard the conversation through the compartment door, which Dean and Seamus had left ajar. "Don't remember asking you to join us, Malfoy," said Harry coolly. "Weasley, what is that?" said Malfoy, pointing at Pigwidgeon's cage. A sleeve of Ron's dress robes was dangling from it, swaying with the motion of the train, the moldy lace cuff very obvious. Ron made to stuff the robes out of sight, but Malfoy was too quick for him. He seized the sleeve and pulled. "Look at this," said Malfoy in ecstasy, holding up Ron's robes and showing Crabbe and Goyle. "Weasley, you weren't thinking of wearing these, were you? I mean, they were very fashionable in about 1890. "Eat dung, Malfoy," said Ron, the same color as the dress robes, as he snatched them back out of Malfoy's grip. Malfoy howled with derisive laughter. Crabbe and Goyle guffawed stupidly. "So, going to enter, Weasley? Going to try and bring a bit of glory to the family name? There's money involved as well, you know. You'd be able to afford some decent robes if you won." "What are you talking about?" snapped Ron. "Are you going to enter?" Malfoy repeated. "I suppose you will, Potter. You never missed a chance to show off, do you?" "Either explain what you're going on about or go away, Malfoy," said Hermione testily over the top of the Standard Book of Spells, Grade 4. A gleeful smile spread across Malfoy's pale face. "Don't tell me you don't know," he said delightedly. "You've got a father and brother at the Ministry and you don't even know? My God, my father told me about it ages ago. Heard it from Cornelius Fudge. But then father's always associated with the top people at the Ministry. Maybe your father's too junior to know about it, Weasley. Yes, they probably don't talk about important stuff in front of him." Laughing once more, Malfoy beckoned to Crabbe and Goyle, and the three of them disappeared. Ron got to his feet and slammed the sliding compartment door so hard behind them that the glass shattered. "Ron!" said Hermione reproachfully, and she pulled out her wand, muttered, "Reparo," and the glass shards flew back into a single pane and back into the door. "Well, making it look like he knows everything and we don't," Ron snarled. "Brother's always associated with the top people at the Ministry. Dad could have got a promotion any time. He just likes it where he is." "Of course he does," said Hermione quietly. "Don't let Malfoy get to you, Ron." "Him? Get to me? As if," said Ron, picking up one of the remaining cauldron cakes and squashing it into a pulp. Ron's bad mood continued for the rest of the journey. He didn't talk much as they changed into their school robes, and was still glowering when the Hogwarts Express slowed down at last and finally stopped in the pitch darkness of Hogsmeade Station. As the train doors opened, there was a rumble of thunder overhead. Hermione bundled up Crookshanks in her cloak, and Ron left his dress robes over Pigwidgeon as they left the train, heads bent and eyes narrowed against the downpour. The rain was now coming down so thick and fast that it was as though buckets of ice-cold water were being emptied repeatedly over their heads. "Hi, Hagrid!" Harry yelled, seeing a gigantic silhouette at the far end of the platform. "All right, Harry?" Hagrid bellowed back, waving. "See you at the feast if we don't drown!" First years traditionally reached Hogwarts Castle by sailing across the lake with Hagrid. "Oh, I wouldn't fancy crossing the lake in this weather," said Hermione fervently, shivering as they inched slowly along the dark platform with the rest of the crowd. 100 horseless carriages stood waiting for them outside the station. Harry, Ron, and Hermione, and Neville climbed gratefully into one of them, the door shut with a snap, and a few moments later, with a great lurch, the long procession of carriages was rumbling and splashing its way up the track toward Hogwarts Castle. Okay, I'm gonna stop there for today. Come back on Monday and we're gonna start the Triwizard Tournament. Woohoo! Have a great, beautiful weekend.